Well, thanks very much, everybody. Now, what I got for you tonight, I got some fun stuff which is new about the First World War, and I'd very much like to hear your reactions about it. I think the fall of Mosul, just earlier this week, has seen a lot of self-loathing and gnashing of teeth by Western powers about, oh well, we drew the boundaries of the Middle East 100 years ago, and now ISIS and all these people are undrawing them and messing them all up, but our original boundaries weren't that much to write home about, and they usually make a point about straight lines and things like that. So it's back in the news, and it's something that we really need to review because it still has salience for today. Those borders are contested, overrun, and there's something in the view that they were always a bit of an artificial construct in the first place. Now I've got two agendas to discuss with you today, but before I do that, I wanted to outline broadly four camps that seem to have emerged around the First World War. And if you follow me through, there's the familiar one of sort of right-wing patriots who still want to persuade us all that Germany was responsible for the First World War, for the Second World War, and indeed, arguably, for the next war. And not for nothing does Private Eye satirize Max Hastings as Max Hitler Hastings. He doesn't like Hitler, he doesn't like the Germans, and he's very anxious to persuade everybody that that was the problem then. There is a second school which has come to my attention, which is also rather right-wing, but has a slightly different take on it. I don't know if you saw Niall Ferguson's television programme about it, but basically by discussing various people in the cabinet at the time, Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, and people like that, David Lloyd George, they put forward the view that it was just a mistake that we got involved. We could have stayed out of it. It was all about Eastern Europe and Belgium. That wasn't so much to do with us. We messed up the diplomacy, and it could have been avoided. And there was a big debate by a rival of the Institute of Ideas, no comparison, of course, Intelligence Squared, just a nice modest brand name that they adopt for their debates, where Max Hastings had a big row with Daniel Sanford, and there wasn't much really light coming out of that heat. I think the dominant explanation today is that the First World War is all about memory, it's all about trauma, it's all about the pointlessness of the conflict, how nobody knew how it would happen, or nobody could understand it at the time. We can't understand it now. There aren't very many clear causes, except what we're left with is that all wars are bad. And I don't agree with that. I think the Vietnam War, for example, against the Americans was a good thing, and I'm pleased they won. So I think that that's a rather casual view, and it's one that very much plays today to today's sort of therapeutic register, or the emotional register, where basically the search for sort of some underlying structures or origins of the war is regarded as a bit redundant. It's how you feel about it. And that's why ancestors and earlier generations and historic memories and so on are so often conjured up. I should say that there's one particular device which I urge colleagues not to get into tonight, which is the view that any attempt to sort of offer a critique of the war is not just unpatriotic. People don't make that point so much because patriotism's a bit of a dead duck the last 20 or 30 years, in Britain as elsewhere, old-fashioned patriotism. But rather the point is made that if you've got to get into any critique of the war, if you think Britain was a bit wrong, or that it was bad news altogether, then you are kind of dancing on the graves of the people who died. And I think that's actually, if anybody does the people who died a disservice, it's people who don't wish to inquire into the origins of the war. And the meaning of the war. Now what the Institute of Ideas, and I believe the Leeds Salon puts forward, is something rather different from these three camps, and much more interesting. The first of it, all in my two-part agenda, is the sort of sociological dimension of the war, which isn't about how much 16-year-olds were involved, or women in the war effort, and all of these things, important though they were, but rather that the war represented, at the time and since, a very important bourgeois quest for meaning. It was felt that life was rather pointless. The sclerosis of the Edwardian era was widely lamented, and it was felt that the war would bring purpose to people's lives, especially the middle classes' lives, a purpose that they largely lacked beforehand. And this is particularly evident while we're on it with the Italian futurists and artists of that ilk from Italy who were enormously enthusiastic about explosions, air bombings, dynamite, and all the rest, because they felt that it would open a new era. It would proclaim a different way of life from the very old monarchist regime of Vittorio Emanuele and all of the backwardness of Italy at that time. And what happened with those artists was just a symptom of the fact that many people felt that what had preceded the First World War in the late 19th century and the run-up to 1914 was a mixture of accelerated industrialization and mechanization which had brought no meaning with it. That combination was unseemly to people, and there was a hope that through violence and battle and fighting for your country and so on, you could overcome that crisis of meaning. The second thing is, which I'm going to major on today, but I do want to dwell a little bit on the meaning dimension, sociological dimension, is to do with the origins of the war, which is rather different. The geopolitics of the war is different from the sociology of the war. And the geopolitics, I think, is quite easily identifiable if you do a bit of homework. It's remarkable how few people want to do that homework today. And the other thing that we need to remember about all of this, of course, is that the causes of the war 100 years ago are likely to be very different from the causes of a war today. I think you only have to look around today, from Venezuela, even Brazil, Thailand, Kenya, Nigeria, the Senkaku Islands dispute in Asia, in the East China Sea, and all around the Middle East, quite obviously, to see that a world war is certainly not excluded in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And on that upbeat note, I just wanted to say that the causes of the Third World War are likely to be prima facie different from the causes 100 years ago. It would be very odd, since history doesn't repeat itself, it's always an accumulation of the past with something new, continuity and change. It'd be very odd if the causes that underlay the First World War were fully present today. Let me dwell first, fairly briefly, with the first item. Really what we're dealing with here is a sort of move in society, in America above all, but also in Germany and Britain, where all the pace and acceleration brought around by new technology didn't seem to avail society one little bit of the kind of goals, objectives, and spiritual kind of resonance that it would like. If anything, it rids society of that kind of resonance and the old structures of patriarchy, respecting your parents, and all of these things. If I were you, I'd have a look at the German film The White Ribbon. It's not for the squeamish. But those of you who know it know that the youth felt that there was absolutely nothing to write home about their parents. When it deals with pre-war Germany, not only was that the case, but if you get a chance, if you have a look at Lewis Milestone's All Quiet on the Western Front, 1930, what he very clearly makes obvious, and this no doubt is true of the book, which was by a German, is just how unanimous support for the war was in Germany. It was a mission. It was something that you had to do. It was something that would give you traction in a world where everything appeared more and more fluid. I think the sad thing about it all was that people went to war with these perfectly human motives, and then they got an awful awakening that the war itself was meaningless, that the war could not be explained in terms of what they encountered, the carnage on the front, the industrialized nature of the war, and the kind of degradation that people were put through, was that really to defend poor little Belgium? Well, we moved to all of these extremes because of treaties that had been signed 50 or 60 years before. There just appeared to be no meaning there, and people like poets like Owen and others, Sassoon, who'd been ardent supporters of the war, were thoroughly disenchanted by it. So was Robert Graves. So that was a very important dimension of the war, and we could explore it. I'm very much looking forward to your own contributions on this. If you take Freud and hysteria, for example, very interesting. I mean, women were widely thought to be hysterical because they could not handle the sort of pace of change, especially middle-class women. And Freud tried to deal with all of that. And it was clear that radically new solutions and a radically new world was shaping up. But to get a kind of grip on it, that was really what the pursuit of meaning really represented, and what the First World War was wrongly thought to be. Let me just illustrate that briefly to give you some sense of this connection between mechanization and loss of meaning. Anybody know this man? Beep, 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 he's Samuel Morse. And if you take Morse and you take the Otis elevator, safety lift, and you take Edison, 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration, if you look at his knees, you can see what he meant. You see all of these developments in the late 19th century which seem to be so wonderful, and they were wonderful. Westinghouse, Edison, the railroad. This is a very important man. He made Porkopolis, or Chicago, what it was. He's Gustavus Swift, the inventor of the refrigerated railroad car, and that took pork all around the United States. And it was all great. It was dry branded goods, packaged goods, the US Postal Service, cash machines at the checkout, ladies' magazines, all in the 1890s, branded items, and even before David Beckham, King Gillette was a brand. Of course, you wouldn't be allowed that advert today, of course, for health and safety reasons. And the department store that grew out of the steel and the glass technologies that were developed at the time. And if you look at the innovations, you know, it's and you compare it with today's much more sleepy record of innovation, no matter how many sexy mobile apps you have on your handset tomorrow. I mean, there really were a great deal of major breakthroughs, and not least was the foundation of laboratories within corporations devoted to the pursuit of pure science. And yet all of this didn't really seem to give the few people, the elites, who were privileged to enjoy the department stores, the kind of direction that they would have liked and the kind of rewards that they would have liked. In 1897, Thorsten Veblen, you may remember, coined the phrase the conspicuous consumption and pecuniary emulation in his important theory of the leisure class. The most you could get out of this period was keeping up with the Joneses. And it wasn't even a mass phenomenon in the way that Cold War America was, right? The suburban period with which we're familiar. So I think that's quite, there was a sort of technocratic impulse, but as Greens rightly observed, usually I completely disagree with the Greens, but when they say that consumer goods and possessions, can't bring you meaning, they're right. I mean, it's true that Deuteronomy said it 1300 years BC, man cannot live by bread alone. But they're right about that. It doesn't do the business. Very few people even had access to those goods. Then very few people could vote. But nevertheless, the people who could felt that it wasn't really cutting the mustard. Now, let me see if I can get this one. No, I've got to stay by the podium. That's all right. So, remembering the run-up to the First World War, there's the earlier periods, Henry Ford, any colour you like, as long as it's black, 1908. And then the father of time and motion study, the man with the stopwatch and the white coat, Frederick Winslow Taylor. If you take those two developments, of course, there's a very important third factor, apart from mechanization, lack of meaning. These kinds of people introduced or sparked a great amount of class tension in America and around Europe. There's a man falling asleep there. Am I that boring, sir? Or is it, I just can't compare with the World Cup? I understand. Belgium's on tonight, by all accounts. You know, when you started sort of filming workers and to get them to work hard or giving them an assembly line and these sorts of things, not only did it appear to be pretty meaningless in terms of just storing up more bits of metal, but also it exacerbated class tension and class feeling. So we might profitably, I think, discuss that. Let me turn to the major narrative I have about the origins of the war. Anybody know who this man is? You look alert, sir. I'm like, well, no, you've woken up. Anybody know who he is?
Is it Ludwig?
Ludwig, nice try. Yes, he is a German. But that's about the closest you've got. He's a guy who said war is the extension of politics by other means. It's Karl von Clausewitz, really brilliant man, a kind of Karl Marx of the military world, an Enlightenment figure. Let me just give you a little bit about the ABCs with a brief interlude from one of his admirers, rather oddly, Bob Dylan, who devotes several pages in his autobiography to how wonderful Clausewitz was, but I digress. ABCs of Clausewitz, well, he was, because he's important. If war is the extension of politics by other means, you know, we better get hit to Clausewitz a little bit if we're to understand the First World War, even though he died in the Enlightenment era, not in the 20th century. Inspired by and hostile to Napoleon, after Napoleon's, you know, smashing up at Prussia, he made a big advance by suggesting that it wasn't diplomacy or etiquette or geometry that governed the course of wars, it was politics. It seems obvious to us, but it wasn't obvious then. It was the state politics, war as an instrument of the state. And he very rightly, and we've got to get the balance right on this, thought that law had its own war had its own laws, it was special, but you couldn't divorce it from the state or from society as a whole. And in fact, he distinguished quite carefully between state and society. We'll come to this in a minute. He felt that there was always some sort of dynamic between war and peace, that peace prepared the conditions for war and war those for peace. He was very sort of keen on the aggressive dimension of war. Taking the fire to the enemy's center of gravity was very important. Always to be strong, and in Zumkriege, he devoted 3 or 4 chapters to the slaughter, the actual physical conditions of killing your opponent. Well, I won't dwell too much on him. The main thing that I want to suggest is that, in fact, when he talked about friction figuratively, you know, the mud in the trenches really did bear him out. Defense did prove stronger than attack, especially for the Germans. Clausewitz was no stranger to deterrence and to wars of attrition, and he also understood, you know, the dynamics of an arms race, that, you know, as people upped the ante, things could get worse. I mentioned that he distinguished between the state and people. He understood that popular hostility to, say, the rape of Belgium and the atrocities that the Germans committed there was a very important factor in war. Second of all, that individual skill as a commander, or lack of it, the Haigues and the Kitcheners and so on, were very critical. And finally, the way in which policy and government and the state was the ultimate arbiter of where wars began, ended, and where they went. Well, there's your little capsule guide for it. Of course, already in the 19th century, many critics of Clausewitz had come along and said, well, look, Karl, you're not really hip to what's been happening. There's the whole question of supply chains. That's new. You didn't consider that. You didn't consider technology enough. And you never had anything to say about navies. And although all of those things are true, the point about Clausewitz, as with Marx, is his method. It's not that the individual results don't modify his thesis. It's whether the, you know, governments, peoples, and commanders-in-chief, anger, state politics, and ingenuity on the battlefield, don't those things remain important, even though the battlefield may be naval, and the ingenuity maybe to do with whether you've got coffee, chewing gum, egg and chips, and all the other things that actually were introduced in the First World War. We wouldn't have egg and chips today if it wasn't for the logistics supply chains providing it. All right, well, that's some useful background, I hope, and it shows that really getting underneath things and looking at the dynamics of war should be able to give us an impression of the origins. Let's now turn to the, secondly, to the theories of right and left on World War I at the time and since, but not really dealing so much with the four camps that I described. The first of them does touch on the liberal camp that I mentioned, the third one, and this is a very interesting book all about the memory of the First World War and the way it messed up the generations and all of these things. And these, what sociologists would call phenomenological accounts, how war felt, have been a very important aspect of discussion on the First World War. The second important aspect is the Hagues and how Britain was lions led by donkeys, critique of leaders in the First World War. And Alan Clark, again one of these right-wing mavericks, with rather critical of what happened, worth a read on all of that. I think the most popular accounts for many years in the Cold War period were pioneered by Barbara Tuchman. And in these two books, she described how the wars were basically sort of intra-family disputes, that Willie and Nicky and Vicky, if you can follow it all, with withered arms and all the rest of it, were all intermarried and probably had some iffy DNA, and they needn't have happened. It was all a bit sort of fraught, and above all, really, and this is conveyed very interestingly by the opening of Oh What a Lovely War, the film, which I strongly recommend, is that you've got all these sort of wizened old statesmen, with powder and flour on their faces, and they're just not catching up with, they're behind the curve with all the technology. We've got these old diplomatic treaties, and they, can't quite keep up with just the pace of change and industrialization and all of these things. You see a sort of GCSE Marxism there, where the sort of technology advances, but social relations, are holding it in check. And of course, there's something in all of these things, right? There always is. There's never any smoke without fire. But these are the mainstream histories. I think where I'm coming from is influenced by Clausewitz and influenced by left-wing accounts at the time, even though left and right don't mean much anymore. The first of those accounts would suggest that capital is inherently aggressive. It's aggressive capital. Before you get to the battlefield, capital is aggressive. It exploits workers. It mounts defenses against acquisition. If you're AstraZeneca and you want to fight off Pfizer, you mount a defense and all of these things. And everybody in consultancy, you may know, I always say I only do tactical work, but everybody in the Fat Four, Accenture, Capgemini, and all of these people say, we do strategy. The word strategy actually derives to a large degree from Clausewitz. It's all about not winning just the battle, which is tactics, but winning the war. So they're always talking these things. So capital has aggressive tendencies from the start, even though it prefers to exploit workers without calling in the police. Nevertheless, the police are always there in the background. Second thing is that capital itself was born out of the nation state, which itself was born out of war. To establish nation states, and eventually to come to the Treaty of Westphalia to sort of consolidate that, you had to have a lot of violence. And in all of that, the establishment of clear class society by capitalism meant that war always had a class dynamic to it. That the class tensions that I attributed to Fordism and Taylorism and so on at the time, that was always true of war, because classes were bound up in the nation states and the societies that had created capitalism, and therefore it wasn't just a conflict between nation states, there was also a conflict within those states between classes. And thirdly, and this is the fact that I'll dwell a bit on this evening, foreign direct investment, the export of capital by leading Western powers, exacerbates tensions and doesn't diminish them. It is arguably the key factor in imperialism. But imperialism isn't just that. It isn't just FDI. It's many, many other things. It has a military dimension. But FDI is probably the most important component to it. All right, now let's have a look. And this is the kind of new stuff which is rather relevant to today. Insofar as we face warlike tendencies today, the people who hate war, we need to be very clear just how accurate their critique is. I can see you waving your thing. So after all this hot air on my part, perhaps you care to open a window there, get a bit of hot air, a cool air in there. Okay, well, Nobel was one of the great dynamisers, there's a phrase, but he also regretted war. That's why I set up the Peace Prize. And the growth of militarism was absolutely important to the subordination of Africa in particular to Cecil Rhodes and these people. But as early as 1906, Britain built the fastest steamer in the world, the Dreadnought, and that really was an example of how the attempt to deter the Germans in fact spurred them on. So you get this reciprocal action about which Clausewitz spoke. And the key point here in the developing military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower later described it, is that the military-industrial complex, it kind of does exist, but it's a pretty rubbish category to describe what's happening. What really happened in this period, especially in the States, is that arms manufacture went into private hands, and that in itself prompted misplaced critiques of militarism. Militarism was put down not to the underlying effort to build empires and as a symptom of that effort, but rather it was put down as the responsibility of particular groups which were not patriotic, which were after themselves, which were on a kind of winner-take-all kind of thing. And they could be Dupont or whatever it was. They were just regarded as unpatriotic, rather special, and not very nice. And therefore it was a very glib critique of militarism. But privatized military-industrial complexes, in Britain as well, met with critics. And foremost among these critics were what I would call the illusionist school about the First World War. They maintained, after Cobden, who was a mid-19th century figure, from Hobson onwards and the Boer War, they maintained that a world war was at least unlikely, if not impossible, because it would be it was just an illusion that a war drive was building up. Why? Because foreign direct investment, particularly between Britain and Germany, Britain in Germany, Germany in Britain, made it irrational for the two countries to go to war. And that theory was pioneered by Norman Angell. So let me just run through these guys, because they're rather important and often rather forgotten. Cobden and Hobson and Angell, not so much. Paris and Brailsford, nobody knows about, are rather important. Here's old Cobden, the Three Panics, and very important liberal theorist and foreign policy specialist. And for him, war, like liberals today, and like the United Nations today, war is always based on a misunderstanding, poor communication. And he felt that free trade and more economic development would make war redundant. And his targets were aristocratic meddlers, Palmerston and his gunboats, and arms traders manipulating the media. Now again, there's no smoke without fire. All of these things happen. And his book, The Three Panics, is about war panics in his day. But the totalistic vision of Clausewitz or of Marx was very absent from this Mancunian liberal. Hobson, who was really the major theorist for the Labour Party but began life in the Liberal Party, he was the major theorist alongside two other liberals, Keynes and Beveridge, which tells you where the Labour Party is coming from. It's really worth getting hip to what he said about the Boer War, just how reactionary his critique of the Boer War was. For him, we were, you know, fighting the Boers when we shouldn't have been, because the only people who were going to profit from it were the Jews in South Africa. And, you know, this little ring of international financiers were, you know, handling all the gold in the Transvaal. Why did we bother with war then? For him, you know, it was absolutely incidental to British foreign policy. We were going to war for the wrong reasons. The wrong people were inciting us to war, and they only reflected their own interests. Now, where Hobson was very influential, including on Lenin, was his more famous work, Imperialism: A Study. And to his credit, he did chart the rise of naval expenditures. I love the showing with an E there, that's rather nice. From 1870 to 1901, of British military expenditures. You can't see the detail, it's just like a PowerPoint from those days. But he, you know, he was very aware that navalism was really growing in Britain. And he didn't like it, and nor did George Bernard Shaw, the famous Irish Fabian imperialist, who satirized the arms manufacturers and arms traders for being unpatriotic, for selling to both sides, and all of these. You may remember the Matrix Churchill affair and some of the Iraq War stuff, which was very much sort of rerun of it. You know, we're selling XSX to the French, and then they sell them to the Argentinians, and you know, then we, have I got the two wars mixed up, probably between Iraq and Falklands, but still the same stuff is said about weapons. There's some sort of silly fascination with who's selling what to who. It's all bad news. It is bad news. These people are not very nice. But that doesn't really account, you're explaining war by weapons. Doesn't do it for me. Now, Norman Angell was a Daily Mail journalist who really popularised in a big, big way. There were Angell clubs up and down the country in every major city to suggest that war does not pay the nation, that internationalisation and delicate interdependence of our credit-built finance and industry prevented war from happening. And many people looked at you. And it's relevant today because people will tell you, well, listen, why would America bomb China when China owns all these treasury bonds? You know, nice idea, but the problem that these people never seem to adjust themselves to is that, you know, war is not a rational enterprise, and capitalism isn't a very rational enterprise. Therefore, irrational actions where you might shoot your own foot off, so to speak, whether it's your English investments in Germany or your Chinese investments in treasury bonds, you know, these things are not excluded. We all remember from the Vietnam era, you know, that we had to liberate the Vietnamese village in order to, we had to bomb it in order to liberate it. This man with the Che Guevara t-shirt is falling asleep. So what is it? Do we need to own, would you?
No, it's just me. It's a really interesting talk. I do get very relaxed during the
talk.
Oh,
well, it's great. I'm pleased that you're right.
You do very well.
A bit of therapy is in order, but maybe we could open those windows as well if you're feeling generous. I'm sorry to go at a rattle, but we're making some progress. You're very kind, sir. Most patient. So here we see with Hobson, you know, more sort of, it's kind of Guardian, E.P. Thompson kind of critiques of, you know, why are we doing this? We don't need to do this. It's all got up by a few sort of mustachioed aristocrats. The common people, or us, the middle classes, are more sensible, and we've got nothing in common with these panics. And then they would make the point, the New York Times made the point, that Crook was in bed with British arms manufacturers laughing all the way to the bank by whipping up a war panic. And that's especially from the NYT. You can't get that on Google unless you really try. And if you go to my website, come on in, please. Take a seat at the front. If you're late for my lectures, that's what you have to do. If you go to my website, you're very kind. I think you're sitting on a mobile phone there. Great. Oh, you got it now. The Marconi, the Italian technologist, who's really brilliant, shares were bought by government ministers in his telegraph networks, and that nearly led to the fall of the government. And of course the ministers involved were Jewish, so everybody had a field day, especially G.K. Chesterton and lots of people on the right. David Lloyd George was also implicated in this. So what we find with the military-industrial complex, which was only nascent in that period, was that it was singled out as a symptom, was singled out very much as a cause. It was a superficial view of militarism. This is the lovely one called Blameless Telegraphy, where government minister Samuels was the postmaster general who was supposed to be engaging in a rant on Marconi shares. They were, that's from Punch, I have the original, they were sort of implicated, and therefore, you know, the underlying and very primordial causes of war were skated over in this rather personalised and glib account. But the prize for the worst stuff on the First World War has to come to two Labour Party figures and pacifists. First of them was Paris. Nobody's read this book. I found it in the LSE library about 30 years ago. The War Traders, be worth getting hold of that. And that's all about these arms dealers and all of this stuff. And what Paris suggested was that there was graft, price fixing, monopoly supply, monopoly demand, the state, revolving doors between civil servants and arms manufacturers, we're still hearing about that today, lack of patriotism, and also building silly weapons that we know would never defend anybody against anything and couldn't be relied upon. And Paris was therefore in many ways a founder of CND 50 years before CND. Nearly all of these positions were adopted by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. But worse still was Henry Brailsford, who was really one of the major theorists for Labour, especially the left of Labour, in the interwar period. He, like all the Labour Party people, thought that the First World War was not going to happen. And this book was written in May 1914, where he said Angel's main positions were unassailable. Well, you know, there's forecasting and forecasting. I'm in the business. But to get it wrong in May when it was coming in October, you know, it's really a bit sad. And he not only got it wrong, but he said he had an inkling of the truth. He said, you know, the war will be for some stake in the Near East or in China, and it will end without territorial changes in Europe, if you please. Completely wrong. A geographical term, Europe, from which the Balkans must always be excluded. You know, nothing patronising about that. So, you know, it's worth knowing, 100 years on with the Labour Party, is why I've never voted for them. Because if they were saying this in 1914, you know, I think when I woke up in politics around 1971, I didn't know all of this. This is much more recent research, but I'd already, you know, thought they were no good. And their origins with the Liberals, you look at the Liberals now, what's their leader called? You know, it should give one pause. But this is the vintage Brailsford. In the heroic age, Helen's was the face that launched 1,000 ships. In our golden age, the face wears more often the shrewd features of some Hebrew financier. That's the internationalism of the Labour Party, with which we're so familiar. Right. Well, thankfully, anti-Semitism isn't quite the force that it was there. But I mean, if this was the Labour left, you can imagine what the Labour right must have been like. So I want to say that you know, the critique was superficial and it failed to prevent the war. It didn't see it, and it did fail to prevent it. And second of all, by focusing on the irrationality of war, it kind of missed the point that it is fundamentally irrational, but that's what happens with capitalism. You know, it's an irrational system. The anarchy of the market is not going to prevent you from doing some really stupid things. You could argue in the Second World War, you know, why did Hitler exterminate the Jews when he could have used them as labor power? Right? Why did he do that? Why did Stalin put everybody in the gulag when they could have, you know, been put to work better? But war isn't like that. You know, you do what you do because it's all much more emotional and mucky than all of that. All right, let's try to get to the root of the matter. The bogus origins and the real ones. Well, the Harvard, oddly enough, historian Charles Meyer has given a great account of the bogus origins of the war and dismissed them. And they're basically three. The first of them is the decline of the Habsburg Empire. And if you look at the head of it, you can see that there was a certain amount of decline going on there. Austro-Hungary, not in good shape by the time of 1914. Second one was the structure of alliances that is often felt to be the source of the First World War. And that's the Entente, Triple Entente between Britain, France and Russia, and then the Triple Alliance between Austro-Hungary, Germany and eventually Italy. And Meyer, I think, makes the point, if he doesn't, I make the point, that the tensions within the alliances were just as bad as the tensions between them. So that, really indicated just what kind of stuff was building up and bubbling under the bottom. Russia in particular was regarded as a wild card by Britain and the French. So it's felt that the alliances were a problem. And the third one that's suggested is the famous Schlieffen plan of the Germans, which was to attack Russia and then do a quick zoom around to be able to keep the Western Front subject to German rule as much as the Eastern. And it was a long-standing plan of Schlieffen, who was a German military figure and prepared well in advance of the First World War. But again, to say that a military plan caused the war seems to me just a little too quick. So that was the bogus origins. We might add that the Schlieffen plan in particular is often highlighted, not least by somebody who should have known better but was too much of a maverick on the left to really do it right, the famous A.J.P. Taylor, who said that what he's doing is getting the cart before the horse, saying that the military build-up is so great, that's what causes war. Whereas he's not asking what made the military build-up. And this book of his, it's different from his photographic account here, War by Timetable, seriously suggested that Germany had to go to war because if once you got on the train, that was it. You were going to go to the front and you couldn't get off the train. Well, there's something in it. Obviously, if you plan lots of logistics and do all of this stuff, there comes a moment where it's quite difficult to switch it off. But again, for me, it doesn't really account for this conflagration. So these are some of the bogus origins. What are the real origins? Well, the real origins, it seems to me, are not just to do with Flanders and Verdun. And that's the most important thing that we need to say today, which is that we've got a very Eurocentric view of the First World War when it isn't Anglo-centric. And it's ridiculous because the First World War was prefaced by Rhodes conquering Africa, by everybody trying to conquer China, by Mahan, the influence of sea power, 1897, Admiral Mahan trying to conquer or providing the theoretical basis for the Spanish-American War of 1898, conquest of Cuba, and all of that stuff, for America dominating Latin America. So you've got Theodore Roosevelt, speak softly and carry a big stick, carry it to the Caribbean. Therefore, I'll do it backwards for you, whether it's Asia, Africa, Latin America, or Central America and the Caribbean, all of those things were really important for the run-up to the First World War. They were the construction of empires, of distinct spheres of influence. And you only have to look at the prevalence of German in Africa today, which hardly exists, right? It's in Namibia. Nobody talks about Germanophone Africa. They talk about Francophone Africa, Anglophone Africa. They're not Germanophone Africa. And that's why Germany felt it needed a place in the sun. It didn't have that. It had Namibia and one or two other things. And that was important if you were entering a period where the world economy was nearly as integrated in the run-up to 1914 as it came to be in the 80s. In fact, a top OECD economist pointed out in the 80s that globalization was actually more advanced in the pre-1914 period than it was in the 80s. Now things have changed since then, but since the 80s, still more global. So if you look around the world, you can see this pattern which Hobson described and Lenin described, but we need to revisit, where the dominant foreign investor around the world takes some doing getting these picks and these stats, was Britain. And you can see that Germany was pretty negligible, and the United States was late to the party, just like it was late to the First World War. Now, we might remember all of this when we ask, well, why was the Entente signed? And to his great credit, Paul Thomas has mugged up all the dates, the crises, the treaties, the gunboats, and all of these things. And it's really, I mean, well done, Paul. I'm waiting to hear from you because I can't follow it all. It's so complicated in the run up to the First World War. But one of the key things is why was there an Entente between Britain and France? And in many ways, it was the fact that Russia was defeated by Japan, which was a very important event in 1905. And after that, Asia, which embraced Singapore, Hong Kong, parts of China, India, Vietnam in the case of the French, Cambodia in the case of the French, and all of these things. And Asia looked much more unstable than it had done with Japan's rise, even though Japan turned up on the British side in the First World War. And that was why France and Britain concluded that treaty. It was a dead letter very quickly, but the treaty alone was enough to make the Kaiser journey to Tangier in Morocco in 1905, and I think there was a further crisis in 1911 around Agadir, showing how events in Asia, in an integrated world economy, could concern the European powers, and sometimes they would play out their disputes in Africa. So what this had to do with Flanders and Verdun, you tell me, because it was to do with the world economy, imperialism, and what was known in the Cold War period as the Third World. I think I'll skip that one. You only have to look at Britain in India. It wasn't just India, it's what we now understand by Pakistan, Burma. I'm not even quite sure what Pegu was, and I think Bhutan managed to avoid British rule, but it was an enormous asset, for Britain, and any loss of that to anybody would have been very dangerous for it. So the military-industrial complex was a symptom, not the cause. The foreign direct investment was fairly clearly for three things. Now, whether that's true today, we might come back to. And it was a clash of empires, not just the slaughter in the Low Countries. It was a world war as much about the East and about the South as it was about Europe. It wasn't just about the Balkans and Belgium, which is what Niall Ferguson said. And we might add, since we noted already that the US was late to the war, that it liked Britain and Germany fighting it out, because that was a way in which post-war America could count on a hegemonic presence in Europe. We might note that similar things happened a bit in the Second World War. You bled Britain dry while pretending to be friendly with it if you were American, and then you could supplant the dominant imperial power and get your way in West-West disputes, really. So America timed it very well, I think. People thought that it would be a short war, like 1870, but it turned out to be a mass war, a total war, a national mobilization. Stuff that began in little places quickly escalated. And there were all kinds of dynamics. Once you did the blitzkrieg, then you were inextricably committed, then both sides were committed, then there was attrition. These sorts of dialectics in the trenches. And what we mustn't forget is you had the Irish, the Easter Rising, 1916, the Russian Revolution, 1917. You had serious class struggles on the west coast of the United States, in Seattle, in San Francisco. All over Britain there were important strikes and misguided protests against the war. So it was a class question as well as a conflict between nation states. And a little slide about whether Clausewitz was outwitted by the First World War. Again, the sort of developments that I talked about before, most notably air power and also intelligence, seem to sort of have gone more modern than Clausewitz. Clausewitz wasn't very good on any of these things. They weren't around in his day. He died in the 1830s. But I think all of these excrescences, and this thing is rather important nowadays, these things were important. But the main thing about them is that war became the business of capitalism, not in a literal sense, but it was much more professional than ever before. it wasn't about individual heroics, it was about the struggle for productivity in munitions and stuff like that. And therefore it appeared more remote. You could, bomb people from a high up. You could go on later in the interwar period to use phosphorus on Iraq if you were Britain. And so the military-industrial complex appeared more separate than ever before from everyday society, and therefore it's all too easy, as Eisenhower later did, to attribute all the ills of society to what is in fact a symptom, not a cause. Rather important symptom, with its own logic. It is special, but it's not autonomous. This was the point that Clausewitz made. All right, well, I think I'll leave the different world today for the discussion. I just want to hint that, what do you want it now? Do you want me to get it done with it, or do you want to go back to it? Which would you like?
There's an interesting time with Steve's thing that you've circulated, having read it. Where the articles that Steve has circulated seems to imply that the causes of the next war are very similar to the other two wars.
Well, look, why don't I just try and knock that on the head, and then we'll have the whole thing. Is that all right with people? Because we kind of raise the issue. We mustn't, we have to understand the First World War in its own terms. I'll try to say that. Right? That's true with any piece of history. And just on your point, that, I want to show that, of course, understanding what happened 100 years ago is relevant today, right? Because the liberal camp that I attacked isn't just talking about the First World War, but is always talking about all kinds of wars. No wars are ever any good, and it's always down to particular sort of interests, or Texaco in the case of Iraq, or Blair, and these sorts of things. Doesn't cut it for me. There are similarities with the past. The main similarities is how superficial analysis of the wars is. The difference is are pretty big. Well, it's a more global economy because of containerization and because of the 80s period that I described. So it's more global than it was in the run-up to the First World War. It's also, especially since the end of the Cold War and 9/11, the aversion to risk is quite distinct from what happened in the pre-First World War era. If I say that all your children are at risk from child abusers, you might disagree, but that was not a discussion, in the run-up to the First World War. And the sense of financial panic had been there in America, and there was a big financial panic actually in 1914 around the Bank of England and sterling. But the sense that banks always go wrong wasn't nearly as entrenched as it is today. Nor was there a tendency to hoard cash and not invest like what we find today. There were big investments in those days, and very few companies had $150 billion worth of cash in the bank like Apple does, as I'm sure you know. And just on this risk aversion thing, if you look at forward projections of war today by the US national security apparatus, it's quite interesting when they debate it in foreign affairs. Even 3D printing, they get nervous about, because it's going to make people redundant, it's going to make Asia even more competitive, and everybody's going to run around with 3D printed guns. So every new development was celebrated in 1914 technologically. Nobody said, Ford, what a bad idea. Taylor, oh dear, we can't do this. Chemistry, and
you can print raspberries with a 3D printer now.
Print raspberries? Yeah. Raspberry Pi?
No, imitation raspberries.
Oh, imitation.
They go off very quickly.
Well, I'm sure that's the more dominant application than guns. But nevertheless, the fear of guns is really there. It's quite different from what happened in the First World War. There are new players. This is Dilma Rousseff. She's got a different haircut these days for the World Cup. And I always like to show her special identification in police records as a bank robber and terrorist. I wish she was a bit more like that than repressing the Brazilian workers now. So they're building underwater cities for getting hold of oil. There'll be new targets, new players, new things to go around bombing. Oil rigs, oil installations, computer centers, these sorts of things. And then there is a sense of, this is a lady who put in $5 million to support the Ukrainian putschists, and memorably said in a cable or something spotted by the Russians, "Fuck the EU," about Ukraine. There are new incitements to war. You know, people are much more reckless today, I think, than they were in the old days. You know, statesmen did try to stop stuff in the old days, and there were no fewer than 19 ultimatums exchanged by telegraph in the final run-up to the First World War. Today, you do a putsch with a bunch of anti-Semites and neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and then you wonder, oh, we've got a separatist civil war in eastern Ukraine. Never thought of that. You know, you put people in Iraq, and then you say, well, we'll let free market forces run it all. Oh, and now we suddenly find there's a sectarian war, then and now again already. So there's no planning. There's much more recklessness. There's much more arbitrariness about war today. And the reason is it's mostly done for media miles and to make you look good. You can't organise a hospital in Leeds, but you can say that you are different from Boko Haram, which is, as we all know, the group that gave us a whiter shade than pale. But never mind about that. So, you know, the new incitements are about looking good, cutting a figure on the world stage, delivering abroad what you can't deliver at home, and making clear that, you know, morals are Angelina Jolie, right? I mean, that's what we have to measure ourselves against. You know, from the sublime to the ridiculous William Hay, you know, it's enough to make anybody dare to war. And then finally, there are new weapons which we all know about, like these drones, becoming prettier, some of them powered by an insect's beating wings for the chip that will spy on your enemies. And also these kinds of things which will Mach 17, New York to Los Angeles in about 12 minutes, these sorts of things. So the new weapons. So it's a very different world. You know, all parallels, even the parallels that I've made, one should greet with suspicion because 100 years have gone down the pike. Now, just to illustrate, we may have got the numbers wrong here a bit. Yeah, we got the numbers, that should be 5 there. But anyway, if you look really where the biggest cockpit for war today is, I would say it was actually in Asia. That's where all the wealth is accumulating fastest, it's where the innovation is shifting towards, and it's where tensions are very high. If you think of Korean nuclear energy, they build nuclear plants in the United Arab Emirates. If you look at China Daily, they're watching the American militarists very closely. China Daily, how many of you read it? English, 200,000 readers, good search engine. If you look at India, the largest oil refinery in the world, you know, they are pioneering a lot of stuff there, even if the displays are by Barco, a Belgian company. So Asia is, to a larger degree, more than Latin America, or even a resurgent, or finally surging Africa. If you look at where the action is, a whole lot is happening in these kinds of places, and this is the 200 airports that China's constructing between now and 2020. Those of you who are worried about an extra runway at Heathrow, it's worth getting this in perspective. And in another 10 years' time, China will be making airliners and all of these things. Now, when we come to disputes and war in the Pacific and elsewhere, in the South and East China Seas, you have to use the CIA World Factbook to work out where half of these islands are, and a lot of them are underwater and things like that, where they've got one goose on them and things like that, and yet, you know, massive empires of today are likely to sort of, you know, complete with nuclear weapons and all the rest of it, could, you know, whether it's the Spratlys, the Senkaku Islands, lots of other ones, can't keep track of them all. Everybody's claiming them, and it's kind of a jockeying for position, which really evokes for me the fact that you're playing to your domestic audience, because there's no raw materials there, there's no market, there's no labour power there. It's entirely arbitrary. You just sort of, you know, brandish your breast. And the results, of course, and this is what the Chinese are already planning with American aircraft carriers, are pretty scary in terms of what we could get into. And the ranges of the missiles, 3,000 kilometer Chinese missile could do a lot. And I think the Chinese at the moment have the only kinds of missiles that can take out a full aircraft carrier. So what we're trying to say here is that this is rather different from the First World War. That the threat of a first strike, given today, which was true of the Cold War, given today's risk aversion and precautionary consciousness, means that you will get into Ukraine even if you don't have a plan for it. You'll get into Iraq even if you haven't got a plan for it, because that way you're trying to preempt things. And in this sense, Clausewitz talking about war being the extension of politics by other means. If politics today is all about avoiding risk and how we're in an at-risk society, and when we've got free-floating anxieties about everything, no wonder war reflects all of that, and we can't decide who to invade next or why we're doing it. Why did we go into Iraq? Was it to liberate women, to get rid of weapons of mass destruction, to depose Saddam, to get hold of oil? What was it exactly? We're still finding out. At least in the Cold War, Peter Drucker, the management guru, had the slogan "management by objective." It's very hard to work out what George Bush's objective was in Iraq, but that's what makes it so much more dangerous. So to conclude, what can we say we learned in this whole thing? Well, one of the things is that Russia is back as a world power. Although a cursory glance of NATO membership in 1989 and today would suggest that Russia is in retreat and encircled by all sorts of people who don't like it, principally Poles and others, Czechs, and now Ukrainians. Nevertheless, what Russia brokered around Syria and what Russia has achieved in Crimea, you don't have to like Putin, I don't, to recognize that the Yeltsin years are behind it. It was a world power up until 1989. It then kind of dipped out of the boxing ring for a bit, but it's back, and it will remain back. So that's one thing, Russia is back in world politics. The second thing is, if you take this Chinese hotel that they're building, they built 30 stories of in 15 days, Asia is where the action is. So I'm not ruling out serious wars emerging on a whole number of fronts in Africa, Eastern Europe, which is not the Balkans, by the way, or other places. But I think Asia is where the tensions are greatest. Right? Already China's back in Thailand, America's back in Thailand, and there's more to come, a whole lot more to come. And this is without talking about Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister who wants to rewrite the Constitution and all the rest of it. And thirdly, the disputes in Asia are quite different from the First World War. And it's quite interesting when people talk about the First World War, they always like to sort of say, we've got to watch China. There's a big attempt to rerun the First World War in Asia now. And they say, look, we've got to, watch China. It's like a rising Germany. It's all very well, but also Russia was rising at that time. So is China an ally, or like we had with Russia before the First World War, or is it an opponent? And I think the thing that is interesting, why I did that little excursion on the military-industrial complex, is that if you say, well, look, why did we go to war in Iraq? The dominant view is for oil. It was all got up by the oil companies and all of these things. And now we hear a little bit more than we used to, that international finance, or what the Ukrainian right calls Moscow Jew finance, is really to blame for all the ills of the world. I never thought I'd see it come back, but it's not long now before the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are going to get a popular readership all over again. It's not a repeating of it. It's rather blended with the sort of Snowden revelations, 40 years of private eye going on about revolving doors and who's in bed with whom. That conspiratorial worldview, which doesn't do justice to the origins of wars, but just concentrates on their symptoms, fetishizes the military-industrial complex. I think that's very much with us today. It's different, if anything, is worse than the Marconi conspiracy stuff that happened in the old days. I do believe, however, that World War I was a Clausewitzian war, because if war is the extension of politics by other means, and politics following a GCSE marks is the extension of economics by other means, the First World War was primarily the outcome of worldwide investment and the struggle for spheres of influence. What does it mean for us today? Well, I think it's also Clausewitzian, insofar as the sort of game of chicken in Asia and in the seas around it is kind of a warlike expression of can't make our minds up, scared about the future, who's going to take the biggest risks. We need to take precautions against risks, and you know, China is a forthcoming Germany, so we've got to pivot to Asia, which is what Obama did 2 or 3 years ago, and rally the Filipinos, the Malaysians, the Koreans if they can, certainly the Japanese, to hostility to China. Not easy for the United States, because the Koreans hate the Japanese as much as the Chinese do, and the Koreans are in bed with the Japanese and America in a military alliance. So we see that, a bit like the First World War, you know, an alliance today can be an antipathy tomorrow. I think what's happening in Asia is a strong expression of the fact that our leaders have lost the plot, and that they will do anything in the most arbitrary and reckless manner to try to establish their primacy and get another term of office. Thank you so much for being so patient.